My name is Rob Turner. I'm one of the regional managers from Accucoms. At Accucoms, we work with our libraries and publishers to find the right content for institutions, researchers and end users. Our strong publisher partnerships consist of independent and society publishers, as well as university presses. And we're also well informed when it comes to open access and transformative agreements, and assist institutes in analysing statistics when it comes to considering any open access or transformative agreements. Now, I'm absolutely delighted to formally announce that Accucoms has partnered with ChronosHub in Europe and Australasia to help institutions streamline their open access workflows. So without further hesitation, I'll now hand over to Martin Jagelhorn, who's the Head of Business Development at ChronosHub, who will now deliver today's webinar.
I said, good morning, everyone. Also from my side, it's a pleasure to have this first joint webinar with Accucoms. We're very pleased as well with this partnership. We think it's very complementary. And we're also delighted, of course, to have you listening in today. And please do not hesitate to ask any questions in the chat, at least. And then Rob will keep an eye on that and invite you on stage, if that's possible, to ask questions orally, or we'll just try to answer your questions that you put into the chat. So I'll give you an overview first, very briefly, of ChronosHub, a little bit sort of the background and the context we're coming from. And then we'll walk you through how we work together with different other universities, but also funders and publishers to navigate the complexities of open access management. And we'll also spend some time in a live demo and walking you through some typical use cases and scenarios. All right, so first of all, ChronosHub is the name both on the platform and the company. So the company is based in Copenhagen, in Denmark. That's where the head office is. And then myself and a few others, we are sort of spread around the globe, or primarily spread around Europe. The platform itself, I think it's fair to say, is the leading open access management system today for optimizing research publishing and reporting processes, where we deal a lot with compliance and APC management and open access agreement monitoring, and used a lot across all sort of stakeholder groups. So we work a lot with different funders, very much on a national level and national collaborations in countries like Switzerland and Luxembourg and Denmark. And so also with consortia and individual institutions, and more recently also directly with and more publishers that use the platform for their processing. And what's interesting is that regardless whether we are a funder, publisher, university, or author, we share a lot of complexities and challenges with open access. So open access is great, of course, but it also leads to quite a number of challenges, as we'll see here. And I'm sure you're quite familiar with this kind of situation already, but just as a quick walkthrough, as you know, we have funders like for Plan S and others that have more and more policies of where you can publish, which makes it difficult for authors to know really where they run a risk of non-compliance in what journals. And so not complying with these publishing policies. But the policies also drive the publishers to develop new business models. So there are currently, I think, 27 different business models or mechanisms for open access, including gold and hybrid, of course, and read and publish agreements and publish and read agreements, but also a lot of other mechanisms like subscribe to open or vouchers and waivers and discounts and so forth. And this makes it, of course, really, really tricky on a university level to go through different kinds of checks and approvals to see that this may be compliant with funders or the own policy, or eligible for being paid for from a central APC budget, and then deal with the actual payments, whether that's directly to publishers or reimbursement to authors. But the worst situation from our perspective is really for the authors, because a lot of the work ends on their shoulders. They have to do the same work over and over again and manually. So they submit to publishers in a way where they're then filling in these long submission forms fully manually from scratch, at the same time as they run these compliance risks and not necessarily knowing who will actually pay for these publishing fees in the end. Then reporting back to funders on the outputs of their grants, same information again, and manually in a different system. And then again, locally at the universities into repositories or CRIS systems, for example. So today, as you know, we have a lot of systems, but they don't talk very well to each other. So the situation is quite fragmented, a lot of manual work, very time consuming and quite costly. So with that kind of a bit dystopic sort of starting point, what we try to achieve through these collaborations between ChronosHub and the different stakeholders is to facilitate the communication between all these four groups. And we do that by trying to integrate with a lot of different systems. So publisher systems, like submission systems on the one hand side, grants management systems into the funders, and CRIS systems and institutional repositories on the university side. Some of this information is also not available straight from a system. So we also work quite a lot to collect data from publishers primarily. And then actually publishers start to use ChronosHub as the source for some of their journal information, for example. And then we complement that with data from a lot of online sources like DOAJ and Sherpa and Unpaywall and Crossref and Lens and so forth. So by doing these kinds of integrations, we can enable the authors to go into ChronosHub, which can be a university branded environment on the ChronosHub platform, where they can look through a bit more than 45,000 journals and simply select their funding source and see for each individual journal whether that offers a compliant route or not. At the same time, we try to bring in any publisher agreements that you have on a university level. So the authors become more aware of any agreements that you may have, whether that is a read and publish agreement that you have opted into, or if it is an APC discount or similar. So that's, if you like, really the first step, to try to bring that kind of transparency to the authors so they know where can I publish in a way that is compliant with my funders' policies, and who will pay for this? Will the funder pay? Will the university pay? Or will I have to pay? Or is there an option that is actually payment-free? We also try to facilitate the second step on the journey in this workflow, and that is to enable the authors to upload their manuscripts directly in ChronosHub, and then we submit it into the publisher systems. In this way, they don't have to fill in so long forms. We just care about the sort of important structural elements. So we know who the authors are, their affiliations, the funder, the grant, and of course the publisher and the journal, and using global unique identifiers for all those different structural elements. So it doesn't only save them time upon submission, more importantly, it enables us to automate all the processes more downstream. Because by having these global unique identifiers in place, we can push data into all kinds of systems in a seamless manner, as they can be matched one-to-one, whether that is back to the funders for reporting on the outputs of the grants, or the funders go into ChronosHub to just see and do the reporting there, or pushing data into the repositories and also automate the full text repository deposits. So that's sort of really the angle from the author's perspective. But then as said, your authors at your institutions may in any case encounter ChronosHub when they go to submit to publishers, like you saw a few examples of before, like Emerald or Carter and so forth, because they use ChronosHub as a submission portal, so one environment to submit into their journals. And then upon acceptance, they use ChronosHub for their license management. So you sign the license agreements on the platform, and then we take care of the billing and collection and facilitating for them to manage their open access agreements with US institutions. And this obviously works in the other direction as well. So once we get data back from publishers, whether they work with us in this close manner or more loosely linked, we then process the data here to do all kinds of checks automatically for compliance and eligibility for payment. And then we have deposit accounts and pay-as-you-go accounts on the platform, so we can manage all the payments also on your behalf. And so very often we work with universities as a prolonged arm of the library. And this means that for a university perspective, well, you do no longer need to go into a lot of different publishers' open access dashboards and try to figure out yourself manually if something should be accounted for or not towards an open access agreement, or if you need to pay an APC. You have one place where you can go. So we collect the data across all publishers. You have access to all articles across all publishers that are affiliated with your own institution. And that's why it also works pretty well to reuse the data for reporting, whether that is for the open access agreements or if it is for populating your local systems. Right, so if we look at the workflow, this is just another kind of illustration on what it looks like. So institutions that have a lot of these challenges or common challenges, well, they use ChronosHub in the way that they offer the authors to log into a university brand environment on ChronosHub, where they can check all these different journals in various ways. We'll have a look at this in a live demo as well, of course. And where the authors can see any agreements you have with publishers, also on individual journal level. For journals that are integrated, well, then they can upload the manuscript in ChronosHub and we send it in. Otherwise, we take the authors here directly to the submission, the submission systems login page. And we capture just one single field, essentially their intention to do a submission. And that also helps us to pick things up automatically. So if you submit through ChronosHub, we get everything back automatically. And if you go directly to the publisher, well, then we have agreements with a lot of publishers to get the data upon acceptance in any case. So typically we get article metadata, and in some cases we also get the invoice this way, through an API, but very often that's sort of a little bit a separate workflow. And increasingly, we're trying also to collect the author-accepted version of the manuscripts to facilitate green open access, which is quite important in countries like Denmark, where we work quite a lot. Once the data is in ChronosHub, well, then we have a number of automated checks, whether that is for funder compliance or eligibility that the funder is paying or the institution is paying, and any publisher agreements that you have. So where possible, for example, where there is a hybrid, let's say you're not paying for hybrids, only for gold, well, then we may give the author the recommendation to go the green route instead, not paying anything, if that is an eligible or a compliant option seen to any funders that are involved. So that's just one example of how we try to work together to simply lower the cost for publishing. And as I said, we do work as a prolonged arm of the library, so we can take care of then ensuring that any approvals that need to be done on a dashboard is done either directly through the integration between ChronosHub and those dashboards, or we actually have a customer care team here that takes care of that and does certain things then manually when necessary. So it's typically only for the edge cases where we're uncertain, based on these automated checks, whether this should be approved or not. And that's where you, from a library perspective typically, or research office, a little bit sort of different from institution to institution, can go in and see all pending approvals on a dashboard in ChronosHub. And that's where you can give your approval, rejection, or a conditional approval. For example, if you insist on a PO number being on the invoice or something else before it should be paid. Then you can, of course, manage payments yourselves if you prefer. Otherwise, we can facilitate that process as well by having a deposit account, very similar to you having deposit accounts with different publishers. Well, here you can have your own deposit account that you own yourself on ChronosHub, but that we have the right to administer. And in that way, we can do the payments on your behalf, and you just essentially reimburse those payments at the end of the month. And then, so it's like, you don't have to put a deposit here for the full year, for example. And for any articles, for any of the data in the system, you always have access to that also over ChronosHub's APIs. So you can pull data on all your articles and associated authors and things like that to populate your local systems, whether that is a repository, a CRIS system, finance systems, typically. These are the three, but there may be others. Right, so hopefully that is all understandable and makes sense to everyone so far. But as I said, don't hesitate to ask any questions at any time as we go through. Just to explain then a little bit more in detail how we ensure that the data gets into ChronosHub. This is one of the most common questions. We have essentially 4 paths, right? So the first path here is completely automated, and that is when you submit through ChronosHub, because then we have a ChronosHub ID associated with the submission, and then the submission systems have the possibility to feed back all that data to us in a completely automated manner. It's a little bit trickier when authors go directly to publishers, then we don't know about those submissions. And these submission systems are typically not able to just filter on institutional affiliation and send us all the data for an institution. But we have, for most of these submission systems, found different kinds of workarounds. So the publishers can send us the data in one way or the other. But it means that we do have a little bit more manual work sometimes to fill some of the gaps. So that's path number 2. Path number 3 is that in some cases, specifically when this is about invoices, then some publishers are quite slow changing their processes. So they still continue, or it slips through simply, and they send an invoice for an APC directly to the author. So we always offer authors this kind of possibility to upload those invoices or any article metadata in ChronosHub. But we also want to lower the threshold really to an absolute minimum. So they also have the possibility, here, to just forward it to an email address. And then we have a more semi-automated manner to pull that data from that email into ChronosHub and associate it with the right author and institution, etc. And so the 4th path here is more for us to identify gaps. So we pull data from online sources for all articles affiliated with your institution. But the problem is that once the data is here, it's already published. So it's a bit late if we were to process an APC invoice or make an approval before it's accounted for towards a read and publish quota, or fix anything seen to a compliance issue. So it's still valuable because we can then identify primarily with what publishers that we are missing out on data. And then we can reach out to them more systematically and prioritize them in a good way to see that we strengthen the relationship or communication paths with them. All right, so hopefully still understandable for everyone. And then we'll move on with just explaining the two sort of typical use cases for authors, and then we'll go into a live demo. So use case number one is really everything, the full process up until point of submission, or until it's submitted. And it's very straightforward, hopefully. So the author logs into ChronosHub. They can be authenticated by your login server if we have that integration in place. Otherwise, ChronosHub authenticates them. Then they go to the list of journals, so the journal finder. And that's where they will see if it is offering a compliant route or not, based on, for example, your own policy, so institutional policy, or if you have a specific funder that you want to use as a default funder. That's all possible. And then they can select any of about 40 other funders today. This can also be extended rather easily to more funders if you're missing any specific ones. And then see for any of those what the compliant paths look like, and we also see if there are any publisher agreements. Right. So journal finder, find your journal, and then once you found the journal, you upload your manuscript, and if it is integrated, we submit it directly into the publisher. If it's not, then we just take you to the submission page for that submission system. All right, so that's the use case for the point up until submission. And upon acceptance is where the author journey continues in this example. So we don't interfere in any way with the peer review process and what happens in the submission system up until point of acceptance is set. And so if all goes well, if they submit it through ChronosHub, the authors do not need to do anything. If they submit it directly to the publisher and we have the data from the publisher in most cases, then still do not need to do anything. So it's again more the edge cases where they may have slipped through, and then the author would need to just forward the invoice to the support email address with some article details, or upload it in the system. So hopefully really not too much to do, and then we ensure the compliance and any payments if necessary, or reporting. All right, so with that said, we'll move over to a live demo. All right, so what you see here is just a login page from sort of typical login page. That's all customizable. So maybe I'll bring up another example here if we get that quickly. Just so you see that this is almost white labeled. You can see ChronosHub typically somewhere in the corner, but otherwise it is sort of your own branding with your own logos and colors and images. And in this case, it's integrated with a login server, so Emerald's login server, which is a federated login server connected with a lot of other universities' login servers. Here it's a direct authentication of the users. So usually username is the email address and then password. When you log in, you're in this case logged in as the author Jane Doe, belonging to the University of Zurich. And again, logos, colors, images is something that is something that we always set up specifically for each institution. So on this landing page, you also get a quick overview, an illustration of the common use cases. And this is more or less what we had a look at just before on the slide. So you can go in and check your favorite journals, or just browse through the journals to see that you find something that is compliant and where you feel that it's relevant for your manuscript to be submitted into. And then you can select that journal and submit it, but of course also go directly to a publisher if you prefer. And then upon acceptance, upload your invoice, and afterwards you can view your articles and potentially do different things with them depending on what use case you would like to facilitate, whether that is automated deposits, for example. All right, so what you also see is simply an overview as an author where your articles sit in the workflow. So they are going from draft through submitted, accepted, and they are published or not accepted. An important aspect here is that authors are sometimes a little bit scared that someone can see their rejections or rejection rates. So first of all, no one else can see the not accepted articles except for the author themselves. But if they have any concerns, they can always delete their article, and then it's completely out of the system as well. But the starting point, as said, is typically the journal finder. And this is where you'll see a little bit more than now 46,000 journals in here. And we try to keep this data really as up-to-date as possible by directly getting data feeds from the publishers. So typically once a quarter, we get updates from most of the bigger publishers. So it's a little bit trickier with the smaller publishers that have just a single or just a few journal titles. And that's why we also use data from online sources, as said, from DOAJ and Sherpa and a few others. And in this list of journals, you see that in this case, we have the SNSF, so the Swiss National Science Foundation, selected by default. And you can click here to find and choose another one, let's say Horizon 2020. This is so not Horizon Europe, this is really Horizon 2020. So yeah, different policies for different programs as well, not only different funders. And depending on that funder's policy, you will directly see here on the right-hand side flagged whether this journal offers a route that is compliant or not compliant. Then you can also filter this further in various ways on subject areas, for example, whether you're into religious studies or engineering or something else. If the journal is indexed in a certain database or journal list, publishers, licenses, and here you have the APC range. And these filters are also customizable. So many have their own journal lists. And in the UK, there are, of course, some connections with the REF and the units of assessment, for example, that could be relevant to reuse in various ways. And if we then go back to the journal information here, what we try to understand and see is then also what type of journal this is. So it's very common that there are different policies or at least eligibility criteria, considering whether this is a gold open access journal, a hybrid, or just a closed access or sort of subscription journal. So we see in this example that with this funder, they would cover any APCs if we publish in this journal. In some cases, we're not certain if it is hybrid or gold. So that's where you see this kind of information. And that's something that we're obviously working on continuously on reducing the unknown cases. And then you see here a case of a hybrid journal. So as an author, we understand that in this case, the SNSF is not covering our fees. But we still see that it's compliant, and this is sort of an important, important to distinguish between the two. It may very well be compliant, but you're not eligible to get any of the APCs paid for. And what's further important is to understand what is then the compliant route, because the author may very well do a submission, but take a route that is not compliant. So that's why we are trying to make that as clear as possible by offering this kind of explanation. Why is this compliant or why is this not compliant? And here we see an example which I actually personally found quite interesting, because there are two green open access options. One with an embargo period of 0 months, and that's okay, because the SNSF is requiring 6 months. But we see that there is another green open access route with an embargo of 12 months, and that's not a compliant option. And then they can also choose the hybrid option, and that's fine. Seen to the publishing policy and the license here, a CC BY. But obviously that's connected then with a payment. So, this is a very recent example where I actually had to understand myself, why are there two different green open access options? And so I looked it up, and on IOP's page, you do find the information that there is a possibility to put the manuscript on a personal website immediately, but so that's where we have the 0 embargo. But if you put it into a repository, well, then there is a 12-month embargo. So this is also an example where it's sort of an endless path of how to make things clearer. So we will probably have to envisage a way to make it also understandable here, that this really applies to putting it on their own website, and this is into a repository, so we don't get that kind of curiosity that provoked me earlier. Right, so that's an example of trying just to explain the compliance aspects and the payment. And if we now look at Wiley here, there is a publisher agreement between the University of Zurich and Wiley. That does not apply to all journal titles, so we see here nothing in particular. But here we see that even though this is a hybrid journal, and our funder, if we have funding in this case, from SNSF, they will not pay. But we do see that there is an agreement in place. So that any APCs for publishing an open access article here will be covered by that agreement. So again, as an author, it's hopefully understandable then really what path that is compliant is set, and who will pay for this. And in this case, it's covered by the institutional agreement. Right. So apart from that, it's possible, of course, also just to search here and combine the filters with the search. So if we search for a plus, we find a number of, so it searches through the title and the description and the subject areas. And let's say we found a journal title where we do want to make a submission. Well, then we can click the submit button here. And the first question we get is if we want to reuse an existing article. This may be an article that is in draft mode, has been rejected, or if we select one that is has been submitted, well, then it is set to rejected. So we avoid the potential issue of having the same manuscript submitted to different journals for evaluation, which is obviously not allowed, not great. But in this case, we say that this is a completely new manuscript submission. But this is where you see that there are possibilities to upload the invoice, for example, in a later step, if that has slipped through ChronosHub for one reason or the other. So this is just like a fallback option, if you like. And then if we click continue here, we get to submission form that really depends on the underlying submission system that the publisher is having for this journal title. When we fill this in, well, here is a single click to associate our submission now with all the grant details and the funder details. So we don't have to fill in the grant title and different dates or grant ID and funder details, etc. It's all in just one click. And that goes for most fields here that we just either selected from a list, and then there are a few where we may need to make copy paste from our actual article, like the title, and then you have the running head and the abstract. So we have that here, and then you just need to upload the. I'll just take a file at random here. Just upload one or several files for your manuscript. Sometimes there are different headings for different types of submissions, for addendas, supplementary files and things like that. Again, depending on the journal. Otherwise, as I said, it's like selecting from lists like this. And so the form should not take longer than maybe a minute to populate. And And that also goes for adding co-authors. So here you can search across all the different authors in all different environments that publishers, institutions, and funders use on ChronosHub. So in many cases, you will find the co-authors here. Otherwise, you can still, of course, add them manually if they are not found. So you just, again, have a single click in that way to associate your co-authors instead of filling in all the details like first name, last name, email address, ORCID ID, organizational affiliation, and whatnot. So the only thing you need to be careful about is to ensure that you have the right, especially corresponding author role here, as a lot of open access deals are of course sort of focusing on the corresponding author affiliation. We won't do the submission here, but we just saved it now in draft mode. So we can always just cut back here and confirm our submission by clicking submit article. But it's really not more than that you need to do as an author. You go to the journal finder, you find your journal, double check who will pay for this and what the compliant routes are. If you feel comfortable, you upload your manuscript and make a few selections like this and press submit. So feeling reassured and primarily then being sure that the process upon acceptance is automated. So we no longer need to do that kind of manual work for reporting back to funders and institutions. Okay. So any questions at this time? Or should we, I can continue to illustrate a little bit what it looks like for an administrator otherwise.
I will just interrupt you there for a second, Martin. So just a couple of questions. First of all, would an agreement between the university and the publisher have to be manually reported, or would it automatically be picked up by ChronosHub once the agreement goes live?
Yes, what we do here with the agreements is that if we work with an institution, we typically get the publisher agreements from the institution. If we work with a publisher, we get their institutional agreements from the publisher. And then we populate it here in the system. So we import it for you. So typically there are no sources for this. Actually, ChronosHub is sort of becoming increasingly the source for these publisher agreements. So what we provide is an Excel template. It's very basic in a way, where it's we can go through the details if you like, but essentially that's where you have all the details on your agreements. So either you provide it to us, or we can also contact the publisher on your behalf to get the data that we need on those agreements. But yeah, it's typically possible for you as an institution to provide that or populate that Excel template, and then we import it for you, which means that it appears here in the journal finder, as you just saw here with the example of Wiley. And the text that you saw can be different. I don't know if it's different here or Elsevier. No, it looks like the same, but there may be quite different conditions. So it's not always exactly this text. So this can be different for each individual agreement or for each individual journal title even. And so that's before submission, of course. But we also use the publisher agreement information upon acceptance. And that's where it's then also automated. You don't have to manually select and say this article belongs to this agreement, because the agreements are set up behind the scenes in such a way that we know that this agreement applies to these journal titles, and it's for this time period. And you may also see that there is a quota for this, so you can see in a specific report how much you have left on the different quotas for different agreements. But you don't have to do any kind of manual assignment on article level to the agreements. That happens completely in an automated way automated manner.
Great, thanks, Martin. Very clear. Just another question. It's regarding more in terms of authors and how authors use the database. How intuitive is the database in terms of alerting the authors at what stage they are at submission, or whether they've hit any problems, i.e. with funding, etc.? So how user-friendly is it in terms of the author being updated every step of the way?
Yeah, so it's a very good question. We obviously try to make it as obvious as possible for them, so they know where they are. But it's also clear that many authors, they go into the journal finder actually before they have their manuscript, right? So it can be a very early stage. They just want to double check and see, all right, if I have the intention to submit into this journal, is it compliant? Will I have to pay for this? Because they do very often look at the journals and their conditions first, so that they know that which template they may need to use if that journal has a specific requirement for certain aspects. And then it's of course difficult for us to pick up or make clear to them where they are in the process for their article. But as said, they always have the possibility here to see where their articles sit in their workflow. So if they have, as we just did here, started this new article that is not submitted, well, it's obviously marked as draft and not yet submitted, so we can view and submit our article. So here the wording is trying to move them ahead in that direction. And then once it's submitted, we don't do anything with it, right? So this is where it sits in the submission system. And the journey continues once it's accepted. So it moves from submitted to accepted automatically. And that's where we trigger an email notification, so they get informed once their article has been accepted or rejected. And then once it is accepted, that's where we do indeed process it. And then it moves automatically over from accepted to published once the publisher has published the article. So the authors do not need to do or take any action, if you like, other than if they stay in the draft mode, well, they have to take action to submit it. That's why we highlight the action here. They don't have to take any action here, here, or here, right? And here they can, of course, view and reject it. But that said, we obviously want to keep them in the loop, hence the email notification at the acceptance level. And we are actually also now further sort of improving that kind of notification here on the dashboard. So you will soon see, as you see on Facebook and LinkedIn and all these other sites, a notification icon. And when you click that notification item, that's where you will see all those to-dos essentially that you have. So it becomes even clearer, and that includes also reminders for any actions. So it's possible that if you want to, for example, we could also automatically send like a notification or reminder to the author saying, hey, you have a draft article here for more than a week. Do you want to submit it? So there are a lot of these possibilities that are possible for you to influence and define as well.
That's great. Thanks, Martin. And yes, I think those those notifications will prove to be very valuable, I think, to the authors. Just one last thing, or there may be two more. How does the system, or how does ChronosHub deal with authors who are across multiple institutions? So they're not necessarily linked to one institution. They may also be affiliated with others. So in terms of submissions or how they tie in with certain agreements, how does ChronosHub counteract that?
Yeah, so I just double check quickly here what the profile looks like, because we do have the possibility for every author to have multiple affiliations. They have a primary affiliation, but and you may recall this when I searched for my own name, is actually in some of those cases the same person but with different affiliations. So you can relate an author representing University X in one case, and the same author representing another university for another article, for example. And we use the sort of the selected affiliations for those for every article when we do different checks. We still, though, come back very often to the corresponding author's affiliation. That is almost a standard. It's not completely there yet with every publisher, but it is clearly what sort of counts the most. So it is a little bit more complicated, of course, where there are some agreements between institutions to share or split costs. If there are co-authors from different institutions that have that kind of agreement. So for those cases, we also work with split invoicing, so that's also possible. We have this example in Luxembourg where actually it's split invoicing between the funder and the institutions. So the funder is only paying up to a certain cap, so 2,500 euro for a hybrid article, 1,500 for gold, and the rest needs to come from the institution or the author. So in those cases, we split it up based on the rules that are in place, so that there are two payments coming in. So we can talk about this topic quite long because it is really sometimes very complex. But as a quick summary, we do use the actual affiliations for every author for that paper, and we primarily look at the corresponding author affiliation as a general rule. But when there are exceptions, then we can deal with that in various ways, and split invoicing is one example.
That's great. Thanks, Martin. One more question. The previous couple of questions come through without a name allocated, so apologies I wasn't able to read out your names, but thank you for those questions. But I can now see a question from Imogen. Thanks for your question, Imogen, and thank you for attending the session today. Imogen asks, you mentioned you should submit to the publisher and notify authors of acceptance, but what happens between that with the feedback from peer review, etc.? Do you pass that between publisher and author, or is that outside of ChronosHub?
Yeah, no, so that's where we don't do anything at the moment. So any updates during the peer review process is happening directly in the publisher submission system. That said, we are actually right now implementing this with one of the submission systems, so Editorial Manager from Aries, which is used by about 6,000 journals. So we will be able to pick up any status changes along the way. So they will also be surfaced here. So essentially, it will be a status, some kind of status information here, whether that is past editorial check and in peer review or whatever it may be. But what we are mostly interested in is when that updates, of course, to be accepted or rejected. But so for some of the journals, there will be status updates also in between. That is a little bit more granular, but for the moment, not yet.
Great, thanks, Martin. Please continue with the presentation.
Yep, all right. Yes, I see we don't have that much time left, but I can just log out here and log in with a different user role, just so you get slightly different view as well. Right. Can you see my screen where it says admin here?
Yes, we can. Thank you, Martin.
Yep. Okay, very good. So there are different user roles. You can be an org admin, or you can be a sort of a institutional administrator and so forth. So depending on, and an author, of course. So depending on your role, you will have access to different types of information and reporting and things like that. And I don't intend to go through all details here, but an important sort of core aspect is what we call the invoice flow. So this is just to illustrate the fact that you have sort of an overview of all the different articles along the process, where you see a few additional steps in here. But sort of upon acceptance, we know that the article has been accepted, but we have not yet received the invoice from the publisher. It's received, going through a number of checks until the payment has been completed. And this covers articles across all publishers. You see Frontiers, Biomed, ACS, blah, 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 etc. And for each individual article, you can then also go in and see all the different details here. Seen to the journal, the article, the status, blah, blah, blah. And the different fields here is something that we try to populate then in an automated manner. And they can come in at different stages. So for example, the DOI may not be available directly upon acceptance, but then we pull it in later in the process. And some of these fields we have to complete manually, because they may be missing from the information we receive from the publisher or the author. And as you see here, we try to keep it really granular. So you can have a lot of different line items here. And all these details are also available over the API. So if we want to populate, for example, a finance system and allocate these different costs to your different cost centers, well, then you can do the reporting on this kind of granular level also in your finance system for financial monitoring. And here we can trigger sort of a manual check for compliance, but that is otherwise happening also behind the scenes dynamically. And so you have, and these tabs also appear actually dynamically, I realize, because many of them were not seen before. There are certain things that are important, like there is gold open access to be eligible for funding, for example. License, sometimes it has to be a CC BY license, sometimes it's more flexible, and so forth, right? So these checks are done automatically, and then they can move ahead in the workflow you saw here before with invoice to approved or accepted. But we also have actually another section that we don't see with this user role for approvals, and that's the approval dashboard, where you can do these approvals, rejections, or conditional approvals. And you don't need to do much more than that, and other than using it for different kinds of reporting. And then you have full insights into all the individual transactions on your different accounts. So here there are actually not so many different transactions yet. This was just launched actually just a couple of days ago. So we can see here different accounts. Here we have deposited 440,000 Swiss franc, accepted, and in the payment pipeline we have 25,000, but none has been transacted yet. But once there are, you will be able to see all those transactions also here in detail and get back to the sort of the even more granular view of the invoice details that you saw before. So this was just to give you a very, very quick view of just sort of a little bit more behind the scenes what it looks like there. I think, Rob, will need to set up another webinar if we want to look a little bit more into details on some of these different topics, whether that is reporting or integrations with CRIS systems or so that we haven't touched upon so much in this session.
Martin, thank you very much for a comprehensive presentation. It's obviously a very exciting database. and certainly very much appears to be the future of open access management. Thank you to our attendees. It's been great having you on this call. Please feel free to continue to send your questions. You can send them directly to me, rob@accucoms.com. I'm happy to share those and liaise with Martin, and we'll certainly get those answers back to you. And yes, depending on feedback, it would be a pleasure for us to present again, maybe in some slightly different areas. But yeah, we welcome any further sessions, and thank you all again for your time.
Thank you very much, everyone.